Greetings, and welcome to Stuffology. We're two old friends sit around and talk BS, Beatles stuff, on a track-by-track basis, pretty much for the sake of it. My name is JG McQuarrie, and I'm here with my co-host, Andrew Deacon. Say hi, Andrew.
Oh, hello. Sorry, I was half asleep there. Even though I knew it was happening, I was half asleep. I can now make a link here to the film we're talking about today, which of course is Help. And I was half asleep, much like the screenwriters. But I don't think I'll bother because that'd be a bit too cliched. Anyway, how are you?
Yes, I'm doing all right, thank you. We're recording this just after Christmas, just before New Year, and I have survived. So that's something. How are you?
Thank you for informing people of that. There you go.
It felt like important news to
Yeah,
communicate.
absolutely fine. I've managed to get through Christmas. I've enjoyed Christmas very much, me and the other half, which has been nice. And I have to admit that I did try and track down a copy of the movie in the last couple of days, and it seems to have disappeared from the various places that I'd originally seen it. So, to an extent, I'm working off the couple of times I saw it a couple of months ago. And dear listener, you might recall if you've stuck with us over the while the discussions of the album that I've made reference to the fact that the film is not necessarily the strongest. Well, JG's managed to catch up and actually watch it in the last few days. Was it as what was it, everything that you remember it was?
Yes, I watched it yesterday, so the day before we're recording this, and I don't think I'd seen it since you and I were at university together, where I had it on VHS. And my memories of it were that it was not great, but passable. It would be a mildly diverting hour and a half in front of the telly in that kind of post Christmas slump where you could stick something on, there would be some shenanigans, nothing to get nothing to get hung about, and then you just kind of move on with your life. It was so much worse than I was expecting. I went into this relatively open-minded. I wanted to give it a fair crack at the whip. Of course, I know its reputation, but yeah, I hadn't seen it in what 20, 25 years. It was not anything that I tried to come into with much in the way of preconceptions, and yeah, it was poor. Yeah, you good self.
Try 30 years. Just
Well,
just
I guess.
you've taken a few years off. Well, when talking about the album, we've said a few times that although the songs are good, the album is more than the sum of its parts. The film doesn't quite work, and I think there's lots of reasons for it. I think it's more product than movie. I think that people have tried to ascribe it an importance that it doesn't deserve. But then I think that's a lot of cultural hindsight and people trying to find something important in it. I was even reading something yesterday that was talking about the kind of snobbery that exists because people rate A Hard Day's Night more than Help as a film, and that's because of the serious and earnestness and the black and white nature, realistic nature of Hard Day's Night compared to the kind of camp buffoonery of Help. I just think, well, okay, well, maybe it's because one's better than the other. Maybe it's
That would be the one I would go for, yeah.
Absolutely. Maybe it's because one has an identity and the other one has a series of locations. And, I wouldn't necessarily say there's much plot in either, but there's more heart in one. And in the other, there's just more colour in lots of different ways.
Well, yes, we'll definitely get onto that discussion before too long. I think that's perfectly fair. And when it comes to something like A Hard Day's Night, I mean, people say it's better because it's better. It's not really anything other than that. And there are certainly aspects to A Hard Day's Night that give it a reason to be beyond a simple cash grab. I think particularly like some of the, I don't know, even really subtext, that's too strong, but like some of the slightly sly class
Mhm.
commentary, particularly around Paul's grandfather, the fact that they're working class boys, all that kind of stuff. Like it's not really heavy-handed, and you would certainly never go so far as to describe it as like social commentary. But there is this idea that, like they aren't coming from like a nice privileged background. They don't have blah de blah. There is some kind of traction to the movie beyond just a cash grab, and everybody seems genuinely thrilled to be doing this. When it comes to help, there's none of that in either sense. That it's not about anything at all. There's that one tiny scene in front of the terraced houses where the two women are going, "Oh, the fame hasn't changed them," but that's the closest we get to anything approaching commentary in this. And there's absolutely no sense anybody involved with this is doing it for reasons other than, well, we get to dick about in Austria and the Bahamas for a while, which, I mean, fine, that is a motivation, but it doesn't result in a great movie by any stretch of the imagination.
I do think that the year between films, you could say that success now seems more permanent. I think there's always a chance that the bubble that existed at the start could burst, and the Beatles themselves were aware of that when they first started going to America as well. Even then, talking about, well, what will you do when it ends, if it ends, and I don't think they thought it would be permanent. I'm sure you could find Lennon quotes at the time that now are being thrown back in the face of various people say, oh, no one wants to see a Beatle when they're 80 and that kind of thing. So there is that sense in A Hard Day's Night that you've got this kind of like insurgency. It's something about being trapped between where you've come from and where you're going to. And the film ends with them making their escape on the helicopter. You could, if we were doing the critical thing, we say it symbolizes liftoff and, that sort of elevation to stardom. You've got the, the working class lads traveling on the train to do this TV show, but then butting up against the old school values of television. Although it's weird to think of television as being old school values when it was still a relatively new medium, but you can sort of see that that's going on. Well, help's much more indicative of someone who's got fame and stardom and doesn't really know what to do with it. So, what do you do when you're famous? Well, I don't know. You do colour, you do locations, you do parody, and I think that's a problem. There's no one to really shoot at when you are now the most famous people in the country. And they almost certainly were amongst the most famous people. So if anything, they're the kind of people that others would be taking pot shots against. But now they find themselves at the top of the tree. It's kind of hard to know. How do you then appear to be this underground insurgent youth cultural force when you're the biggest thing there's ever been?
Well, indeed. And the fact that they can't quite pull it off is kind of interesting. Generally speaking, Magical Mystery Tour is what people will say is the first really real crack in the armor, but it isn't. This is, I think, it's the first instance where we have something which is being creatively produced by the Beatles, which is less good than something they have previously created. That's not to say that necessarily every single album they've released has been better than the one before. I definitely wouldn't want to make that claim. But every album, I think, has at least something on it that you could point to say, well, this has progressed from that. This has progressed from that. Or tracks on With the Beatles that would never have appeared on Please Please Me and so on. And there's always that sense of progression, of moving forward. But comparing this to A Hard Day's Night, there isn't much progression. There are things that you could point at and claim were more progressive. The fact that it's in color is obviously the big one. But also, that isn't really one. And like the film looks really good. Like there was a restoration done in 2007, I think it was, and it looks great. I mean, it's really crisp, it's really clear, it's very visually striking. And that does differentiate it from A Hard Day's Night. But I think the problem is that's all it is. They don't really make much of that as such. And so yeah, for me, this really feels like that first chink in the armor. It's the first bit where you can point to something the Beatles have done and gone, this isn't meaningfully as good as they've done it
But do we
before.
actually know how much creative input they had into this? Because
Very little, and I think that's the problem. It's visibly clear that they do not have the kind of creative input. Lennon gave an interview where he made this quite explicit. I think a year or two after this, and said that it's the quote about them feeling like extras in their own movie or whatever. But they had much more limited impact, and it shows.
but then they're also extras in their own movie because they spent half the time getting absolutely wasted.
Well, yeah,
And so
exactly.
they weren't really able to contribute very much. But then I suppose this is also partly the impact of the constant wheel that they're on, the 2 album a year, plus singles, plus a movie wheel that they're currently on, in that there is no opportunity for them to take a step back and to then go, okay, well, this is what we would like to do. This is the version of ourselves that we would like to represent. um, and it's just it's difficult because once again they play a version of themselves, which means you've got 4 central characters, and then you've got that sense it's going to be an uneven representation of those 4 central characters, because obviously you're going to need to try to give story time to everyone. But you know what? Let's again give a focus to Ringo, because who knows why. They think they quickly worked out, didn't they, on Hard Day's Night, that McCartney couldn't act. So, he didn't get much of a storyline there, doesn't really get much of a look in here. Lennon's kind of reduced to a few quips here, there, and everywhere. And it just feels like there's no attempt to take their character and to really sort of exaggerate it, to push it on. And I'm kind of minded to think that with modern day film stars, they obviously don't do these sorts of things anymore, where they do their representations of themselves, except as cameos. It feels like it's a much more 21st century thing to do, to sort of say, okay, well, we know that Ed Sheeran can't act, so what we'll do is we'll have him in a scene in whatever that Beatles movie was called that I can't remember now. Yesterday, that was it. Well, we'll have him in there, and he's kind of being himself and kind of acting a little bit as well, and that's fine, and that will help. But you wouldn't give Ed Sheeran a whole movie. You might give Robbie Williams a documentary for him to narrate and have him represented by a monkey, but you're not going to make him act in it, are you? So there's different things that people do now.
That's true. And one of the things that's shifted is that kind of representation has moved kind of from music stars to actors. You get a lot of TV shows now where people are playing exaggerated versions of themselves. You take something like, say, Meet the Richardsons or Episodes with Matt LeBlanc, and they're playing these kind of sort of larger than life versions, which are loosely based on themselves, but you're not really meant to take it at face value, and that's precisely what we have here. So it's kind of shifted across a wee bit from one type of performer to another.
There aren't many of those Elvis films where you would say that he is playing Elvis. I mean, obviously, because he can't really act, he's always Elvis.
Yeah, he's always Elvis.
Insert Roger Moore joke here. But there's no sense that, oh, look at me, I'm this famous pop star. There's always that attempt to insert him into a romance, or a light comedy, or sometimes both. So there's that sense, at least, that they're trying to get him to act. Varying degrees of success, obviously.
Yeah, I think the thing with Help is also that, I mean, we just don't actually spend that much time with any of the Beatles.
It's because there's 4.
Well, yeah, that cuts it down. But even given that, there's just not that much sense that we spend time. There's no equivalent scene in Help of like Ringo mournfully wandering around London. Like, we get 3 or 4 minutes in A Hard Day's Night, which is just focused on one character, and it's this very kind of maudlin but rather charming performance. It's pretty much the thing that launches Ringo's movie career, and it's lovely and it's delightful, but we actually get to spend time with him doing that, and we get to spend time with all of them. They all have their little vignettes, their little moments where they get to have a couple of minutes like George with a fashion thing where he's going to be a fashion star or whatever. Like everybody gets their little moment that gives them a focus, but nobody really has that in this movie. Ringo doesn't even really get any focus, despite the fact that he's ostensibly the lead and the person that everybody's after. He gets to deliver a couple of droll one-liners, and then it moves on. Might as well not bother being in this. John Lennon delivers the occasional quip, and sometimes George is in shot. We just don't spend any time with them, so there's no real sense that even the exaggerated characters that we're trying to be portrayed or that we're trying to understand, they're just not here.
So I think if Elvis is one potential template, another potential template is the TV actor making the leap into films, and I'm thinking in particular of another 1965 vehicle here, which is Morecambe and Wise's The Intelligence Men. And it's interesting to read the reviews and to see how poorly that was received, because Morecambe and Wise still really, really funny. And it's very interesting. There was I think the BBC the other day had their last BBC Christmas special from 1977, and the good lady her indoors, who as listeners may remember, American, has not seen much in the way of Morecambe and Wise, didn't understand a lot of the references, didn't know who most of the co-stars were. She just couldn't help but find them funny. In particular, Eric Morecambe, genuinely funny. And I think it helped that that we'd also then been watching another very average adaptation of Scrooge, this time with Suran Jones. It was a Sky production, and Morecambe and Wise, or rather actors being Morecambe and Wise, were the Ghosts of Christmas Past. Actually, they were really good. It was really quite, obviously it was a hyper realistic version. Everything was exaggerated, and I think that then helped with watching the Morecambe and Wise special. But really genuinely funny and anarchic, and I almost think everything that the likes of Lennon is trying to be, only perhaps like to think it's a little bit more clever. But then The Intelligence Men just isn't any good. It's almost as though the writers forgot to take the best bits of Morecambe and Wise with them into the movie and just put them into, let's see if you recognise the plot, a bit of a spy caper where someone ends up in a situation through being mistaken for somebody else, which I realise is also the plot of North by Northwest, but let's not get into that because that is a genuinely good film. Okay. So I almost feel like by trying to avoid the Elvis model, they've ended up with the Morecambe and Wise model, where they've kind of forgotten all the best bits of the Beatles, that really anarchic, sort of stick it to you kind of sense of humour, almost self-parody as well. And they've just ended up with a really limp version that doesn't do what they think it's going to do or what they wanted it to do. And it's a shame. I mean, Hard Day's Night thinks it's got that outsider focus, but then, and this is where I think looking at some of those other British films of the time, there was that move towards some greater sense of realism, of telling ordinary stories, and even if some of them are a little bit surreal in their own way, but thinking of the likes of Billy Liar or the loneliness of the long distance runner, films that weren't, when we were growing, weren't on television very much, but they are really highly regarded. And I remember about 20 years ago going back and watching quite a few of these, Room at the Top, Saturday Night, Sunday Morning, This Sporting Life, lots of films like that were telling stories about ordinary regular people and putting them in perhaps in some normal situations where they face crisis, or having an ordinary person in an extraordinary situation. And there was something amazing about seeing all of those when, of course, you're brought up on the kind of films that most people think of from the era as being like, The Great Escape or James Bond. But there's one big difference between those sorts of films, the Billy Liars, the Loneliness, the long distance runner, so on and so forth. They all came from short stories, novels, or plays. Whereas Help, unfortunately, is pretty much written on the spot, and that
And it shows.
and it works with the Beatles in the studio. It works. Write a song, rehearse a song, play the song within the space of a day or a week. It works, but then that's a 2 minute pop song. This is a 2 hour, 90 minutes, 2 hour film, and it needs more time. You can't just make it up in the way that they have.
Well, yes, exactly. And that whole well, I mean, like, the whole make it up DIY ethos. You can do something with that. This doesn't though. And the worst sin that this movie commits in my eyes isn't that a lot of the jokes don't land. A lot of the musical sequences are kind of nonsensical, good in their own right, but illogical. The acting's weak, blah blah blah, whatever. But the worst sin this film commits is that it's boring. For 1 hour and 29 minutes, exactly the same thing happens. Then the ring comes off Ringo's finger, and then we get the end credits. That's it. Nothing happens in this film, and it's not nearly enough of the jokes land in order to be able to kind of sustain that sort of forward momentum. That's the thing. It's just dull. When they start to enumerate, oh, here's 5 other ways that we've done this. Here's 3 other ways. For fuck's sake, get over it. No, it's a very, very boring film.
So I've written it's seemingly based on personality rather than story.
That's a more succinct way of saying what I was trying to say.
It
yes.
is. I mean,
but it doesn't work. It doesn't work. The personalities aren't there, and it's exactly what I was saying before. We don't spend enough time with those personalities to get a handle on them. With all our kind of non-Beatles characters, we have racist stereotypes, and we have Leo McKern and Victor Spinetti doing a mad scientist shtick. It's not enough to compensate for the lack of Beatles.
So before we get on to the very iffy elements, I think the cast is something that's worth picking up on, because there are some
Definitely.
extremely good people in here who've done some extremely good work in other places as well. I mean, Leo McKern is just a towering genius.
Acting royalty.
And I'm going to illustrate that by failing to remember the name of a film that I've seen. Was it The Day the Earth Caught Fire, I think? Science fiction film from, I think, the 60s, where he's playing a Fleet Street reporter, and basically the world is catching fire. It's heating up over the course of a week, and disaster is occurring. And he is absolutely phenomenal in that. And I'm sure that there'll be other people who remember him from the likes of Rumpole at the Bailey as well, which I didn't really appreciate when I was younger and it was on television. But now I sort of almost feel he's one of those incredible comic characters up there with some of the ones that P.G. Wodehouse created. There's something, I think is it Johnny Mortimer, I think, that wrote Rumpole. There's something in that is just absolutely timeless and hilarious. And Leo McKern is really responsible for that, but he's not given very much to do here. Roy Kinnear is someone who has, legendary. He was part of the satirical boom of the early 60s, which no doubt influenced some of the humour that the Beatles were projecting as well. But again, he's not given anything to do here other than being bumbling. Victor Spinetti is one of the carryovers from Hard Day's Night, where he plays the TV producer who's a little bit sort of all over the place, trying to be in control but really isn't. And here we have that ridiculously stereotypical madcap scientist. There's so many weird choices, so many interesting people who could have done interesting things, but they're just given madcap or zany things to do here, which just feels ever so slightly unforgivable. And that's before we even get onto, which we will do in a bit, we get onto the accents that some of them have to, and okay, so but this is something that I don't want to use phrases like, oh, well, to be fair, but It's a difficult balance, isn't it? Because we hear about how the Beatles were supposedly insistent on not playing segregated venues in America. Okay, that's great. But the UK had its own problems, some of which took the form of the black and white minstrels and their continued popularity. It does make you wonder why we've fallen into the trap of othering here and making out people from other cultures to be the enemies in the way that they are.
Well, do you want to get into the race conversation now then? Because I have things to say, unsurprisingly.
Do you have anything more on the cast? We've not even touched on the maleness of it and Eleanor Bron again.
Well, I did want to mention Eleanor Bron, one of the great leading lights of 60s and 70s, also part of the satire boom, an amazing stage actor, here given a dress, which is nice, and very, very little else. I'll also just very briefly, because I would be remiss if I didn't mention that, but Leo McQuarrie is also probably the best number two in The Prisoner.
Oh, okay.
And he is extraordinarily good in that. It's a really amazing performance. But yeah, Eleanor Bron is great. She's an amazing actress, incredibly talented, and she's just given nothing to do here. She doesn't. At least Leo McQuarrie and Victor Spinetti get shtick. Like, all she does is just run around for a bit. There's nothing. There's not even like a character she can try and get a handle on. There's not even anything she can do to try and sort of zhuzh the piece up a wee bit. It's so sad to see so many talented people being wasted and so little that does anything for their their actual skill. And that's kind of, I mean, that's the TLDR of this movie, an amazing collection of incredible talent just given nothing to do for no reason. It's such a shame. And I can't even really think of a moment in this movie where I can go, oh well, there's a little thing that Eleanor Bron did that tried to bring out this, let's say, character, or whatever. Like Leo McQuarrie can save almost anything. He's so good at just being bumblingly affable, and he's very lovable, and he's able to give something with that. And at least Victor Spinetti's got the whole kind of uptight, ooh, I could take over the world if only the government would give me a grant thing. It's not great, but at least it gives him something that, there's some little bit of characterization there that the actor can get a handle on. But Eleanor Bron is just given nothing. She gets one moment where I am not what I seem, and then she's exactly what she seems, which is a nothing character forced to run around after everybody else. It's very dispiriting.
Okay, I have a challenge for you.
Okay.
Because we're about 28 minutes in, and I suspect this has probably been quite tiring listening so far for Beatles fans if they've made it, because it's two middle-aged men dumping on something the Beatles did. Before we move on to, oh my God, I can't believe they did that, I want you to pick me a couple of things that actually are memorable in a good way, that are positive, that you'll go, yeah, that was really good.
The Ticket to Ride sequence is great. It's really, really good. I like that a lot. I think it's very well executed. I really, there are a few debates I find more, this is me being positive, there are a few debates I find more tedious than the who invented the music video one, because nobody invented the music video. It's a generative form. It iterates through performances in movies, and then eventually stand-ins for TV, and then eventually what emerges as what we would now recognize as a music video. Nobody invented it. This certainly doesn't invent it. In fact, Paperback Writer and Rain have a better claim. But it's a great sequence. It looks fantastic on screen. It's well executed. It's concise. It's occasionally actually funny, not in theory funny, and it's just a lovely little sequence in the movie. I really, really like the way that Ticket to Ride is delivered.
Okay, anything else?
It's quite short. No. I can't just leave it at that kind of. There's actually You know what? There's a couple of times. It's very understated, but there's a couple of times where the movie delivers a really funny line, and it kind of gets swallowed. And the one that really stuck out to me is when they're trying to get the ring off Ringo's finger at the mad scientist's location, and they turn on all the equipment. And I think it's John Lennon says, "What's your electricity bill like?" And the reply is a sort of long counterfoil. And it's great. It's sort of almost proto airplane. You want him to say, but that's not important right now after it. There's a couple of times where those lines in the movie are there, and it's genuinely funny, and it's funny in a way that isn't just zany antics or what. Like, it's a really well written line, and I wish there had been more of that. Even that line, it's really swallowed by the film. Like, it doesn't linger; it moves on. It's very easy to miss if you don't catch it. But it's really funny. Yeah, it's kind of proto airplane, and I wish there'd been more of that. But that's a great line, and there's a couple of instances of it in the film. So there you go. There's another one.
The house, the terrace house, 4 doors in. They all go in their separate door, and then it's all one house behind. Is so iconic.
That's such a great
it's
gag.
so clever, and so parodied, and so on. You wish they'd done more with that. There's such opportunity for delving into that, and every time I see that, I'm sort of reminded of the Ray Davies sequence from Absolute Beginners. All I want is the quiet life, where he's sort of going up and down the stairs, and you sort of see a cutaway. And I remember seeing this play at the National a few years ago. August Osage County, the Tracy Letts play, where you've kind of got again the cutaway of this big house, and you sort of wish that they'd done something more with the interior. Could have been so playful, so interesting. But then with the interior, the sunken bed, I think again is so kind of so 60s. It's such an iconic 60s image of the bed sunk into the floor, to the point where you just think that that's a wonderful idea. Although of course then you also think, oh my god, how do you change the bedding? Oh my god, that's ridiculous. And I think there are I think there are two very good musical sequences. I don't think there's anything that matches some of the sequences in Hard Day's Night, but You're Gonna Lose That Girl, which I think is the original one in the studio, is really well shot, fantastic, even to the point where it sort of ends with the gag, the gag about the noise that they could keep hearing, and it turns out that someone's been sawing around Ringo in order to try and capture him. And then to go back to the house, You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. It's really simple, really stripped back, and very minimalism. It's done with a sense of minimalism. Sorry, as opposed to some of the other overblown productions on Salisbury Plain, which are just weird. So there's that, and it emphasizes the song in a way that I think the record doesn't. I think it really adds something to it through its staging. So I think there are, but that's part of the issue, isn't it? That there are moments there, and unfortunately those moments aren't sufficient to make it the kind of whole that we would want, as opposed to it being the kind of whole that it is.
Hey,
I don't know where that came from. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So, do you think it's a coincidence that in 1965 George Harrison discovers a love of Indian music?
well, that's the big cliche about this, isn't it? It's like, no matter what you think of it, this is where George picked up his first sitar, and that becomes a thing. Um, okay, that's nice. I'm not really sure, but it's not relevant to the movie, though. It's that thing about looking forward. You go, oh well, okay, we know that this is going to go on to be a major influence in the career of the Beatles. We know it's going to change the trajectory of what the band do and all the rest of it. That's fine and that's great. But particularly if you're trying to look at this from a 1965 perspective, it's also meaningless. It doesn't matter that George picks up a sitar during this. It doesn't matter that it becomes an influential part of what the Beatles are going to go on to do, because in this movie it's just an excuse for some really bad jokes and some aren't foreigners weird material, which is just awful. So, no, clearly it's not a coincidence, but it also, I don't think it matters. I don't think there's anything about the future that really resonates within the context of just watching this film as people would have done in 1965.
I do think it's worth doubling back to that initial conversation we had about how much of an impact did the Beatles have upon this film, its creation, its cultural value, and and it's on the one hand fair to say that people were manipulating them and their image and their music in order to make a profit for the studio. At the same time, say that they could have been more aware of the images that were being created. And I do think it's a shame that the representation in the film is the way it is, whether that's the misrepresentation of the religious imagery, and turning belief into a cult, whether it's the white people pretending to be Indian, right down to the makeup and the accents. But I also wonder if there is that sort of underpinning it. There is that, and I'm going to try and intellectualize it here, which could be a mistake. So hold on to your hats, folks. There is that sense that post World War II, there's that conflict in British identity, whereas perhaps going into World War II, there was still that sort of national belief that we were on top of the world looking down on creation. And yet, of course, as we know, World War II, at the start of the war, America had an army the size of the Romanian army. By the end of the war, it was the greatest military power in the history of forev's man in it. And World War II saw Britain and America completely swapping roles. And even though we still thought that we were important because there were a bunch of countries that were ruled by London, directly or indirectly, that power was significantly waning. But one of the ways in which some people can hold on to that power is to mock those who are not the same. And we've done that for decades now with, for example, the Germans. So there's always been that sense in British humour over the last 40 or so years, 50, 60, 70, 80 years, where it's perfectly okay to rip on, the Germans because, we're trying to present that sense of cultural superiority. But more than that, there is that sense of Orientalism, isn't it? That someone who looks significantly different to you needs to be othered, needs to be represented as someone who is different, someone who is outside, someone who is a threat. And whether or not the Beatles deliberately or knew that they were doing it, or deliberately thought that it was something to do, it is disappointing that there does not seem to have been conversations about, just because we can do this, it doesn't mean that we should do this.
Well, I think there's a number of interesting points there.
Thank you.
The very
Woohoo.
thank you. My pleasure. I think one of the interesting you mentioning the Germans, and of course, it's ironic that the whole the Germans don't have a sense of humor stereotype is wartime propaganda. That's where it comes from. It's not something that existed prior to that, and the fact that we still repeat it as something which is acceptable to say even now. If you look at comedians like sort of Henning Venn, who still takes stick for it, it shows how successful propaganda can be, I suppose. But it's also really, I think, significant to note that when it comes to sort of issues around race, the American experience and the British experience are very different. They don't directly map onto each other. So contemporaneous to this, you have the rise of the civil rights movement in America. There isn't an equivalent in the UK to that. And the way that race and cultural identity are portrayed within Britain is kind of, it's that thing that I was saying before about, looking at this film from a 1965 perspective, and whether you adjudge this film to be straightforwardly racist or whether it's simply very, very heavily stereotypical. And when it comes to it, I think the thing is, if you have to judge that by the standards of the time, because by contemporary standards, of course it is. It's white people essentially doing, well, it's brown face, not blackface, but slapping on the boot polish. It's, oh my god, it's funny accent, and it's just so cringy. It's so cringe inducing. It is very bad by contemporary standards. However, by the standards of 1965, we kind of almost have to give it a pass. And the reason for that is because it's the definition of institutionalized racism. It is racist, and I just don't think there's any question of that. But in 1965, it probably wouldn't have been perceived that way, because that is how a lot of people who are maybe from India or from the Far East would have been portrayed. You've still got it going on sort of 10, 12 years later when you get to things like It Ain't Half Up Mum, which is exactly the same. One of the central characters is a white guy in brown face. And that's the thing. It is the literal definition of institutional racism. It's easy to go to a concert in America and say we won't play segregated concerts, because it's very visible when you have that kind of segregation, black people over here, white people over here, but it's also abroad, so you're looking at a culture from outside it. But this kind of representation of people who are from India or from the Far East or whatever, that was the norm. It's not just that it's disappointing that it never that it's portrayed this way. It's kind of, they were in that cultural milieu. It might not even have occurred to them that there was something wrong with portraying these characters in this way.
Yeah, I was just double checking with the Steve Matteo book, because I remember reading a critical assessment of it from the New York Times, but actually, in fairness to what you've just said, it's actually from 2018. So unfortunately, Help is awash in cringeworthy Orientalism, more than could be laughed off as merely musical style comedy of the day. But then, of course, he goes on to say, but again, to back you up, that Leicester is still in top form during the playful snowbound Ticket to Ride number. Yes, I mean, it would be fascinating to know what the reaction was, whether there was a reaction. I mean, it's not just Ain't Off Hot Mum, it's Spike Milligan as well, into the 70s as well, with was it Mind Your Language, Curry and Chips. I mean, there were, as yours was Curry and Chips, I think there were these representations.
Mind Your Language was bad, but there were actual people of that race in that sitcom.
And I think Spike Milligan was able to defend it by saying that he was born in India. Okay, fair enough. But not. And also there is then the question of, well, what is being satirized? And, perhaps this is where my comedy is very, very clever. You don't realize what the target is element to it. But there's also the, oh my God, it's nothing. If you start putting restrictions on what I'm able to make jokes about, then comedy is dead kind of argument as well. I mean, all of which are total hogwash. Have some common sense, people. But I just think that if you're going to project yourself as being in that new realm of understanding where there is a line, as it's possible that people who write histories of the Beatles are keen to do, with the references to the segregated shows in America, then I think there also needs to be the recognition. I'm not speaking properly today. We've been going on longer than we normally do. That's probably. There also needs to be the recognition that they were capable of stuffing up, and bless them, love them, weren't they fantastic? But this is enormously retrograde, and you would hope that as they were able to challenge certain cultural norms in other areas, that this also would be one that they were able to challenge as well. But then they're obviously blind to the female representation in these films as well, which ain't great. So wherever we look, we are seeing that there are. Should we just be polite and say these are representation of their times, and yet, of course, their music is kind of not. Yeah, I don't know. It's complicated, and I feel that again, two white male blokes aren't necessarily the best place to have this argument, other than to say people should have been a lot more aware of it than they actually were.
Well, that's perfectly fair enough, and obviously we have to acknowledge that, at least as far as the 1960s went, it's doubtful that anybody introduced Indian music to the UK more than George Harrison. So it's certainly not a one-sided debate, but it doesn't make having to sit through it any easier. That's the thing. It's a tough watch these days, and you know if it was, well, no, even that's not. I was going to say, if it was just like the fake skin coloring, that would be bad enough. But we also have to have the funny accents, and we have to go to an Indian restaurant where there's a belly dancer and all this kind of stuff. It's all just incredibly clunky and poor. And the belly dancer is other than Eleanor Braun, like that's the female character that pretty much gets the most screen time, which also says something.
Let's not forget that in a few weeks' time, we're going to be discussing a song which has the lyrics. You know where I'm going. I'd rather see you dead, little girl, than to be with another man.
Well,
So we've still got some problematic areas to discuss, and I get the feeling from the reading that I have done that the Beatles have said more about the problems created by songs like Run for Your Life than they have about the Orientalism in Help, which I think is a bit of a shame. And dear listener, please correct me if, as usual, I'm completely and utterly wrong.
well, I think the thing is that because Run for Your Life is on an album, people talk about Rubber Soul all the time. There are plenty of people who will say, Rubber Soul is the best Beatles album. Spoilers, that's not my opinion, but there are plenty of people who will make that claim. And it is a great album, but then it ends with Run for Your Life, and that's not something that you can just ignore or gloss over. But when it comes to something like Help, it is kind of easy to gloss over it. It's not part of the discography. I mean, the album is obviously, but not the movie. So it's easy to kind of listen to the album and go, oh, this isn't a bad album. This is all right, and none of that is particularly visible on the album. There isn't a song as bad as Run for Your Life. There isn't the Orientalism that exists in the movie. So it's easy to listen to the soundtrack or the album, just go, okay, yeah, it's a pretty good album, and then just leave it at that. So it's much easier to gloss over, I think, rather than the conspicuous visibility of Run for Your Life.
I wonder if availability has something to do as well, in that Help is
Probably yes.
very rarely on television these days, whereas Hard Day's Night gets an airing on BBC Four every couple of years. And we also get into that reminder that they were not actors. George Harrison's best acting comes in his one small little line in The Life of Brian, for example. It's not an actor. Ringo Starr had a film career. We could debate at some point whether or not he was ever really a proficient actor. McCartney. Lennon tried to have an acting career.
Have you ever seen How the War Was Won?
No, and I think it's well, maybe I've
How
seen.
We Won the War. Sorry.
Yeah, maybe I've seen little bits and get put off by it. Yeah, and a little bit like his poetry as well, the nonsense rhymes that he wrote as well, that small doses perfectly okay, but actually doesn't really work when you spend any particular time with it. But then also it could be that we're into that element of scarcity as well, because there's quite a lot of comedy from the 60s that is thought of incredibly highly because it is so scarce these days. And I think that's where there are, again, some more links to be made. And we think of some of the humour of the time as being particularly challenging the establishment, being way out there, and oh, isn't it so clever? And the likes of Not Only But Also with Peter Cook and Dudley Moore is a fantastic example of that. And that there are some incredibly funny sketches. Not a huge amount survives, but there is some stuff that does survive that is just frankly abysmal. Not Only But Also starts in January 65. Lennon's on episode one. Yeah, it's okay. There's a Christmas episode in 66 where there's a Beatles skit and a Beatles skit that's supposedly again about their Indian music phase that is just not funny. It's just really painful. And Lennon's involved in a sketch there where he's a doorman at a club, and again, not funny. But I wonder if it suffers. No, it doesn't suffer. Let's turn that around. I wonder if, again, with Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, for example, like with a lot of those early 60s comedies, they have been given more deference than they actually deserve, because we've seen the handful of sketches that are good, that have survived, the old oh, I've got nothing against your one leg, unfortunately neither of you, that sort of thing. But there's an awful lot that just doesn't work. And can I just remind you that when we were at uni, we were there was one of our friends who had some of the Derek and Clive albums, and they were absolutely hilarious to begin with. And then after a while, they're funny because you want to be laughing at them so that you appear to be in on the joke. And actually, after a while, the joke is just two really pissed men sitting around being as insulting as they possibly can be. And that's limited in terms of its cleverness.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely true. And a lot of the problem with how we view those cultural artifacts, I think, does come from the cult of the best of, and Monty Python is particularly guilty of this. And a lot of people refer to this movie as kind of proto Python, which is not really right, I don't think, or even proto Douglas Adams, which is definitely not right. But it has that the idea that it's clearly drawing from the same roots, i.e., the Goon Show, but they're kind of branching in different directions. And a lot of those kind of those examples that you have, they really benefit from that cult of the greatest hits. And Monty Python is as guilty of it as anyone. They put out, and now for something completely different, they re-recorded all those sketches, which was essentially a best-of package. So instead of having 4 seasons of a lot of kind of inconsequential stuff, you get, of course, the sketches that end up becoming famous. You get Lumberjack, you get Dead Parrot, etc., etc., etc. That's great, but it means there's a lot of chaff which kind of gets left by the wayside. And one of the things about, of course, shows like Not Only But Also, Monty Python, all those kind of shows, they're very influential. And that is one of the defenses that people will mount for Help, that it's a very influential film. But influential isn't a synonym for good, and there is a reason for that, because they aren't. Now, I'm not going to deny that obviously the Pythons have their moments. I'm not going to deny that Not Only But Also does, or Derek and Clive, or whatever it is. Of course they do. But if you take their entirety, the influence they have, it's kind of a bit like looking the wrong way down a telescope, that you're looking at it from the wrong way. Influence doesn't necessarily equal great quality. And certainly when it comes to Help, I don't know. Even the idea that it's influential, I kind of question, because I don't like you if you want to make the argument about music videos, all right, that's sustainable. But you could also make that argument for Cliff Richard, who has performances in all of his movies. You could make the same argument for Elvis. It's not something which is unique or specific to Help, or indeed to A Hard Day's Night. And I think it's John Lennon claimed that this was a big influence on the Adam West Batman series,
Yeah,
which
he claimed that. Yeah.
that that I would be interested to say. All right, Mr. Lennon, how?
I think because of the cartoon nature of it, the bright colours, the vivid, element of that, and the whole general
Yeah,
zaniness
I
doesn't take
I
itself
I
too
have my
seriously.
I have my doubts. I have my doubts. I could think of other antecedents that might be a little bit closer to
Well,
the mark, particularly in American television.
the other thing that people have tried to ascribe to it is being part of the surrealist movement as well, and I think that really is ascribing too much cultural value. And if it is surrealist, I think it's much more accidental. But then I would also say that a lot of surrealist humour is situational, and actually in terms of comedy, it's not even trying to be funny. It's just trying to be a bit kind of willful and obscure. So, and this is a little bit too catch-all. This is a little bit too broad in its humour, and to really sort of be able to be given the moniker of surrealist. I do think that there are regular attempts to intellectualize something like this. You know what? The Beatles got better throughout most of their recording career. You can argue about the whole Let It Be thing, but that's fine. If we sort of go with the view that the side two of Abbey Road was really the last thing put together in the studio, roughly, then you could almost say that they peaked right at the end. There would be an argument for that. Whereas you could take the films and say that actually they lessened in quality as they went on. And that's because it was a world that they didn't really know as well as the world that they were in, the world of music, where, they were listening to records, throughout their childhood. They were surrounded by music. They played music. Cinema doesn't seem to have been as big an influence on their early cultural life. It doesn't get written about in the same way that music is written about in terms of influencing them. So it's kind of understandable that they are not as versed in the grammar of cinema, even the way in which cinema can be revolutionary. So it's fine. Let's not build it up to be anything more than it is, which is a bunch of situations that were written probably 5 minutes before they were performed. Slight exaggeration, I know, with no sense of coherency, and a plot that is so ridiculously cliched that you would wonder whether or not actually Zucker, Abrams and co might have been responsible for it if it wasn't for the obvious absence of actual jokes.
Well, yes, if Zucker had done it, it would have been funny. Yeah, it's it's a shame in a way that the second film does fall as flat as it does, and even like the little attempted parodies in it, like the little James Bond riff in the music with the van trying to take off and all that. It's not funny. It's just a you recognize this reference joke. And like if you wanted to be super generous about it, there's that line in Goldfinger that Bond gets about, there are some things that just aren't done, such as drinking a Dom Perignon 53 above a temperature of 38 degrees. That's as bad as listening to the Beatles without earmuffs. And ha 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 ha, yeah, Ian Fleming was an old stick in the mud. What a surprise. So, like, if you want to say, like, they're getting their own back from that, because the movie would have been released the year before this, Goldfinger's 1964. Like, you could try and maybe sustain an argument to that, but not convincingly, I don't think. And that's the problem. Like, even the odd moments where, like, you think the film is trying to do something that might be a bit different, like, it still doesn't really land.
Yeah, yeah. Although we could have a conversation about how even, and we've done this before with some of the Beatles songs, how even the worst of the Beatles films are still better than an awful lot of the films being written for other British pop stars of the time, which aren't remembered. No one cares about the Dave Clark 5 movie anymore. Cliff's films very very occasionally get an outing. I don't think Espresso Bongo's been on television in years, but The Young Ones was on the other day, and I made it through about 3 minutes of it, and it's a classic. Let's put the show on right here to save the club kind of thing, which we've encountered before. So at least they're not doing that. At least they're doing something which could potentially fit in with the wider cultural milieu, as it were, of spy movies and capers and that sort of thing. It just would have benefited from a couple of runs at the script and a bit of time, and not forcing them to do something every 5 minutes. Because there's some decent songs. There are some decent songs in the film, and they could have made something around those. But instead they're just kind of inserted in, aren't they? And you have this weird storyline about, the band need to record some songs, so let's put them somewhere where the whole of the British Army is going to be in order to protect them. And yet actually the British Army can't protect them, which is odd. Maybe we could make a case of saying, well, that's satirical, that's a satire of Britain's declining significance in the world. But it isn't really, is it?
No, well, I mean, you could try and make the same argument about the fact that the mad scientist everything the producers made in Britain, and it's all rubbish, and the Americans, they produce much better stuff, but we just can't get the funding, you see, and all that. Is that a satire about the decline and fall of the British Empire? No, it's not. It's a slightly amusing gag about how everything's a bit rubbish.
How about that this is a prototype Seinfeld, because it's a series of episodes in which no one learns anything.
And nothing happens.
And, they attempt to get the ring, they don't get the ring. The Beatles and the powers that be don't learn anything from it. And they just put them in another situation where they're unable to protect them. The baddies try to get the ring, they fail to get the ring. Blah, 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 so on and so forth, until you get to the end and, they lose the ring, they find the ring, and then they turn on themselves. Yay! Yay! Yay!
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just sort of thinking we're up to an hour now, and I really feel sorry for anyone who's made it this far, because they're probably now thinking, what have they got left to talk about? I mean, we could talk about the fact that it did make money.
Oh yeah, it certainly made money.
For the film had 3 times the budget of A Hard Day's Night, and it made a bunch of money. It made 10, 12 times its budget in box office. So it was popular, or rather it was seen by lots of people. We got them going back to America and going back on the Ed Sullivan Show in order to promote it, which then gave us, even though obviously it's not part of the film, McCartney playing Yesterday on the Ed Sullivan Show. So we get stuff out of it, but there's better stuff to come.
There sure is.
So, at this point, is there anything else that you want to add?
No. Is there anything else that you want to add?
Watch A Hard Day's Night. It's great fun. Listen to Beatles albums. Watch the Monkees TV series. It's shorter. Watch, even if you want to, watch some of the animated. I was about to say animated Beatles cartoons. Duh. Watch some of the Beatles cartoons in which the Beatles don't actually appear. Watch the Beat Bugs on Netflix, which uses Beatles songs in an interesting and creative way in stories aimed at children. There are lots of really interesting things. It's just that this isn't one of them. And we've taken about an hour to say that over and over and over again. So do please, listener, give us some feedback on whether or not some rebalancing of the Beatles cultural hegemony is the kind of thing you're after. Because, remember, we're not here to diss on the Beatles, to use the language of young people, just merely to point out that perhaps some of the things that they didn't do well help to shine on the things that are simply stunning. And there's many more things that are simply stunning.
Absolutely. Score, please.
Are we doing scores? Oh, this is a well, I don't know. I mean, it's not a great film. Am I comparing it to Hard Day's Night, or am I giving it a film score? I mean, for me, would I ever watch it again? No. So that probably puts it in the realms of 3 out of 10.
3 out of 10. Yeah, that seems fair. I'll give it 3 out of 10 as well. I was debating whether to be generous and give it 3.5 out of 10, and that doesn't seem generous. In fact, that just seems even more insulting. So you know what? 3.
Just to break it down, I'm giving one mark for the house. Okay, and front doors, that gag, 1 mark for that. I'm giving it 1 mark for the the song in the studio, and I'm giving it 1 mark for trying.
That seems fair. I'm not going to break it down. It's just an impulse. Right, we're at 1 hour 7 minutes at this point, so let's wrap it up there. You can really get a hold of us if you want to. We would really like to hear your opinions about this movie, whether we're right, whether we're wrong, whether we're somewhere in between. You can get a hold of us by email. We are BeatlesStuffology@gmail.com. We're on Twitter @Beatles_ology, and we are Beatles Stuffology on Instagram. You can find my blog at www.jgmcquarrie.scot, where you can also read my review of One Hand Clapping, if such a thing appeals to you. Please like, rate, and review us on whatever podcatcher you're using so that more people can find the show. It really does make a difference, and it really does help us to increase our audience, so that would be very much appreciated. Next episode, we are going to come to the end of our journey as far as help is concerned, and we are going to be discussing the album in its totality. But until then, keep listening.